Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our Sunday school, September the 15th. As we continue our lesson, we are now in our fall quarter lessons, which cover September, October, and November. And these few months, the first few months, we talk about Daniel, and we talk about the story of Daniel and how they were tested, and how they faithfully did not turn away from God, His laws, and His practices. So we continue on. The lesson is titled "Two Prophets of God." And our units, our first lesson is three units. The first unit is faithful service of Daniel in France, and we cover Daniel's honors God's law, and Daniel's friends refuse to bow. So we're talking about Daniel and the things that he went through, and the things that he learned, and the things that he had to overcome, and his friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So, as we continue the story of Daniel and how his friends trusted in God so much that they were willing to lose their lives for what they believed in. Think about that. They were willing to lose their lives. How many of us are willing to lose our lives? How many of us are willing to go as far as death to hold the laws and the practices of our God, the God of Israel? I always say, I have kids. If anybody, mess with my kids, I'm willing to die for my kids. I'm willing to see my maker for my family and my blood. But this is different. This is a little different. This challenges my thinking. What Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were willing to die for was a little different, But before I continue the lesson from last week, I want us to go back some generations prior to Daniel and his friends being in captivity in Babylon and see how they got there. How did they get there to Babylon? Well, let's find out. If you remember last quarter lesson, we had a lesson called Young People of Faith. We talked about two great kings, King David, which we've heard a lot of great stories about over the years, the great things that David had did. And we also talked about King Josiah, who was made king at only 8 years old. And he was known for bringing a time of reform during his reign as king. And he tore down all the idols in the land and brought the people back to the God of Israel. Well, I want to talk about a few kings before Josiah. And that got God so furious to where he brought destruction upon his people. King Manasseh of Judah. Manasseh was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned Jerusalem for 55 years. The Bible says he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And I'm going to read you the things that he did in 2 Kings, starting in chapter 21, verse 2. Let's read the things that Josiah did that made God so angry. Starting at verse 2, it reads, "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices." I'm reading from NIV. "Following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Ezekiel had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the stereo hosts and worshiped them. He built altars in the temple. Think about that. God's temple. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord said, you remember what the Lord said? He said, in Jerusalem, I will put my name in the two courts of the temple of the Lord. I will put my name. In the two courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the stereo hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. Practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spirits. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. Verse 7 says, he took the carved Asher pole and had made and put it in the temple of which the Lord had said to David and his son, in this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not again make the feet of the Israel wander from the land I gave their ancestors, if only they will carefully to do everything I command. I commanded them, and will keep the whole law that my people did not live. I'm sorry, to keep the whole law that my servant Moses gave them. Verse 9 says, but the people did not listen. The King Manasseh led them astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. Think about that. They did even more sinful things than the nations that the God driven out of. This had to have been the worst king of Israel. The Lord said through his servants, the prophets, Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these detestable sins. He has done more evil than the Amorites who preceded them, and has led Judah into sin with his idols. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will stretch out Jerusalem, the measuring line used against Samaria, and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab. He says, I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. Verse 14 says, I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and give them into the hands of enemies. It says they will be looted and plundered by all their enemies. They have done evil in my eyes and have aroused my anger from the day their ancestors came out of Egypt until this day. Verse 16 says, moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. Besides the sin that he had caused in Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Manasseh was an evil king. He followed all the practices of all the nations surrounding him. Not only he did that, he said, I can do even better. I can beat y'all. I'm greater than y'all. I can do more sin than y'all can do. He didn't call it sin, but these are what the things that they did. They worshiped other gods, sacrificed their kids, had people sacrificing their kids. Just imagine that. God's people, And also after Manasseh, his son that preceded him, King Amon, he did the same evil things that his father did. And we talked a little bit about Amon's son, King Josiah. Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king, because they assassinated Amon. And when they said, and during that time, the kingdomship stayed within the bloodlines. So they anointed the 8-year-old to be king. The greatest thing that the King Josiah did was he destroyed all the things that his father Amon and his grandfather Messiah put up. He destroyed the idols. He wiped out all the evil people in the land. He restored the land. And he made the land, and he got the people back right and back in standing with the God of Israel. But that didn't stop the destruction upon the people of Israel. That didn't stop the destruction brought upon his people by the kings before him. After Josiah reigned, the destruction of the Jews began to take place. First, the Pharaoh of Egypt captured the next king of Judah. And then shortly after that, the mighty Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, invaded the land. And it happened just as God has said in the Messiah and Manasseh's days. It happened just as it did. Second King chapter 24, starting with verse 10, explains how it happened. It says, at the time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiakim, king of Judah at the time, his mother, his attendant, and nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. It says, in the 8th year of the reign of king of Babylon, he took Jehoiakim prisoner. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal places and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile. All the officers, all the fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. He made Matna, Jehoiakim's uncle, king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. So he took all the officers and fighting men and all the skilled workers and carried them to Babylon. Left only a remnant in the land. He left only the poor of the nation of Israel in the land. And 3 of the Israelites carried into Babylon were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whom we speak of in our lessons of Daniel. These men were some of the brightest of all the house of Israel. The Bible calls them in Daniel chapter 1, starting with verse 4, he says, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's place. Yeah. These were the men among them. So verse 6 goes on to say, among those who were chosen were some from Judah. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azrael, Abednego. Or sometimes we say a bad Negro. So this is a story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which we are into now. The Israelites were tested even in those days under the rulership of Nebuchadnezzar. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how Daniel and his friends were given meat that the Babylonians ate that was against what was prohibited for them as Israelites to eat. And Daniel and his friends, they stood strong. And they ate only those things that were prohibited by God. You know, I know in these days, you know, I know here in America, we eat kind of, you know, a lot of things. You know, so that's something we might need to, you know, do some teaching on, you know, what we need to eat and what we should be eating, you know, because a lot of things, you know, in the Black community especially, you know, we have high rates of death and cancers and things like that because we're not eating the right foods, you know. So that's something, you know, that's something for another day, but, you know, something I think we need to address, you know, in our community. But they stood fast. They stood fast and they only ate those things that God told them to eat. They were tested. And last week we saw the testing of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But there's another important story that was not listed here, but we will cover that a little shortly. So during King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, we learned that he built a 90-foot statue. And he commands his people to bow down and worship him. In Daniel chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, it says, so the king summoned the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the astrologers to tell him what he had. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong. It's supposed to be in 3. There we go. So he says he then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officers to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. Verse 3 says, so the strappers, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other officials assembled for the dedication of the image of the king. And then the king makes this proclamation that whoever does not fall down and worship this statue, will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. And as we heard last week, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down before the statue. They already worship a God. They already seen what this God can do. They're not going to bow down to the statue that was made. They knew of the great things the God of Israel had done. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar was very furious. He was very furious that they would not bow down to this statue, this 90-foot golden statue that he put up for these people to bow down. What was crazy, the crazy thing about this is that King Nebuchadnezzar had already had his run-in with the God of Israel. A time before this, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it frightened him. And he summoned all the wise people to tell him what this dream was. And he tells them, he said, tell me what this dream is. He says, well, they say, well, tell us what the dream is, and we'll will interpret it for you. He says, no, I'm not going to tell you what this dream is. I want you to tell me what the dream is and then interpret it for me. So they were, days, trying to figure this out. And they were like, King, we can't do this. You got to tell us what it is so we can interpret. He said, no. He said, if y'all can't tell me this, I'm going to kill all the wise men in Babylon. I'm going to kill them all, kill you all. That was even the Jews, the wise people of the Jews. Well, Daniel heard of this, and he goes and they pray about it, and they ask King, they ask their God, God, please, please let us know. And then God reveals this dream to Daniel. Yes. So Daniel, through the help of God, revealed to him his dream. Daniel tells the king, not only tells the king that only God of Israel can reveal these mysteries. The king then places, after Daniel tells him this dream, the king then places Daniel in a high position and made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon. And I know my mother mentioned last week about, where was Daniel at? When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were prompted or was told to bow down like all the other people of God to this statue. Well, the Bible doesn't, to my knowledge, doesn't tell us, but I believe his high position that he was in excluded him from participating in this practice. So the king Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue and forces the people to bow before this 90-foot gold statue. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down, even in the face of death. Which brings us to our lesson today. Daniel's friend trusts God. And it comes from Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 28. And I'm going to read the NIV version. Daniel's friends trust God. So now the king is furious. These Jewish boys don't want to bow down to my king, to my statue that I just erected. They must be punished. Daniel chapter 3, starting at verse 19 reads, Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And his attitude towards them changed. Because remember, these were some of the wise men, and he promoted some of them. So it says his attitude had changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Chapter 21 says, So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Chapter 24 says, King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, Certainly, your majesty. He said, Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of God. Imagine that. He sees the Son of God before the Son of God even on earth. He sees the Son of God before even the Israelites know about the Son of God. He's looking at the Son of God right here. At this time, they only know about the God of Israel. The prophets has spoken to him, but they didn't know They didn't know who the Son of God was. They knew who God was. So he says, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. Does that sound familiar? Come out. That's what Jesus did to Lazarus. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. So they were amazed, like they got thrown in this fire, this burning fire, and they come out of this fire and they look just as good as when they went in the fire. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. The last verse says, Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And I ask you today again, are you willing to lose your life? Are you willing to go that far for the king that you serve? They were willing to do that. They were tested, and we are tested in our days, and we will continue to be tested. He tests us to make sure that we are trusting in him, and that's exactly what he did here. They trusted in God, and he delivered them, and that's what we have to do today, no matter what we go through, whether it's at a job, whether it's in our families. Our job is to practice the laws of God and trust in him. Trust that he will make a way for us. Trust that he will deliver us as he did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we have more to talk about in the book of Daniel, but I'm going to stop here because the next lesson we'll talk about Daniel prophesies the Son of Man. And I'm sorry, actually, we will actually be traveling next week. So we will not have Sunday school or Sunday service next week. So the church will be traveling out of town next week. So we ask you just to visit some other church, some other church that you might want to visit. This is your time next week to get a word from some other church, just to, get out and, so you're not without the word. We most definitely want you to have the word. And it's also good to venture out anyway, see some other things that churches are doing that you can probably come in and bring here to help this church grow. So, great time for this. So the following lesson after that will be Daniel sees future kingdoms. So I think we'll probably do two. Yes, I think we're gonna do two lessons actually. Daniel prophesies the Son of Man, and Daniel sees future kingdoms. So that's gonna be a great time because you're gonna get two lessons. We're going to get two lessons in one. So that's a great gift. We're going to get two lessons in one. So I thank you all for coming and listening to me. And as I give you some history on how they got there, how they got to Babylon, and some of the trials and tribulations that they're enduring and going through, and how they trusted God through it all. I thank you all for listening. And if you have any comments and concerns or questions, please send us a chat message. If there's anything else, thank you all for attending. We're now conclude this lesson. Amen. Amen.